Hello. It might be kind of old news now, but you may have seen the Red Komodo, Red's latest small cinema camera aimed at the lower end of the camera market, at least compared to their other camera offerings such as the Helium and the VistaVision. The Stormtrooper editions of the Komodo, which are like the beta versions of the camera, have been shipped out to people, so we've started to see reviews, we've started to see test footage, so I thought I would talk about my thoughts on the camera. So if you're not familiar with the specs of the Red Komodo, it has a Super 35 6K sensor and it can film in RAW. This isn't particularly surprising, this is what you'd expect from a Red camera, RAW and high resolution. Somewhat more interestingly though, this camera also has a global shutter. This is pretty unusual for a camera of this price range. In fact, there aren't that many cinema cameras or any other type of camera that uses a global shutter. Just a quick refresher if you're not 100% sure what a global shutter is. So normal cameras, they use a rolling shutter. So you've got the sensor which sees the light and the camera processor needs to read out the sensor to see the image. So what most cameras do is they don't just take the entire sensor at once. They go through each line, reading out the image line by line and then compiling that together into your frame. This works fine for shots where there's not much movement, and actually cameras can now read the sensor so quickly that most of the time there aren't really any problems. If you've watched any camera reviews, I'm sure you've seen reviewers talking about rolling shutter, seeing how bad it is, and because if you move the camera and the camera is scanning line by line, you've got a car or a pillar moving through frame, it looks kind of slanted because it's at different positions when the sensor is reading different lines. But overall, with the current readout speed, it's not too bad in most cases. The one which really annoys me, and I'm sure it will really annoy you too if you've shot any weddings for example, is when you've got a photographer with a flash, they take a photo, flash goes off. If the flash were to illuminate one frame for just a frame, just the entire frame, that would be fine. But that's normally not what happens. Normally you'll have the top third of a frame will be really bright, but then the bottom 2/3 will be the normal exposure. And that's the problem, or that's the fault of the rolling shutter. But with a global shutter, you don't have any of that. You don't have any skewed movements, and if you do have photography flashes being caught in the frame, they will be caught all at once or not at all. So this is really cool. Now, one of the reasons why we haven't seen very many global shutters is because they do generally cause a drop in dynamic range. And whilst the Komodo doesn't have as much dynamic range as the Helium does, it does seem to have around 15 stops, which is a very respectable amount of dynamic range and certainly worth the trade-off of a global shutter. Another rather unusual thing about the Red Komodo is its lens mount. Lots of Red cameras have used either a PL mount or an EF mount, but this, the Komodo, uses a Canon RF mount. In fact, I think it's the first third-party camera to use Canon's new RF mount. This is a really good thing because, as far as I'm aware, Reds don't have internal ND filters, but with the Komodo and the RF mount, if you want to use EF lenses, then you can use the Canon ND EF to RF mount adapter, and effectively you have built-in ND filters in your Red. And if you do want to use the Canon RF lenses, there are some really nice looking lenses, especially the 28-70 f2. That's like 3 or 4 primes in one lens. Insanely sharp, insanely high quality, insanely high price, but an insanely cool lens. Next we move on to some actually quite un-Red-like features. If you've been following Red, you may have seen the controversy about their mini-mags, how they're basically just, it's like a SATA SSD flash drive and they've just packaged it in some Red branding and then charged an exorbitant amount of money for it when there isn't really anything special about the engineering. More happily, with the Komodo, there's actually quite a big lack of any proprietary accessories needed to make the camera run. For the recording media, you can just use normal CFast 2.0 cards. It takes Sony L-mount batteries on the back, it takes 2 of them. I imagine it will drain through batteries quite quickly. And one of the most expensive Red accessories, which is basically mandatory for most of the Red cameras, is the red touchscreen branded monitor, which allows you to control the camera. However, the Komodo has a built-in touchscreen. I think this might be the first Red camera with a built-in touchscreen, but either way it means that you don't need Red's proprietary monitor because you can control the camera settings and the menus from the camera body itself. I imagine you will want an external monitor or a viewfinder, but it doesn't have to be a really expensive proprietary Red one. Although something to bear in mind is that pretty sure the Red Komodo does not have an HDMI port, so it's SDI only, so you're going to need an SDI monitor, which they're a little bit more expensive than HDMI monitors. But SDI is a superior connection, and potentially it's a bit smaller than an HDMI port too, so I can understand that. Talking of things being a bit smaller, the Red Komodo is tiny. The pictures of it make it look small, but I don't think you really appreciate just how small it is when you see it compared to normal everyday objects and other cameras. Like, this camera is tiny. This could be a really good crash cam for Hollywood films. It could be the perfect gimbal camera. It could be set up in really small places that normally you wouldn't be able to set up a full-size cinema camera. I mean, if you've seen the Alexa Mini, it's smaller than a regular Alexa, but it's still not a small camera. In fact, it's basically bigger than my C100 Mark II. But this, the Red Komodo, this is properly a mini cinema camera, so that form factor is pretty cool. The test footage so far that I've seen, it looks really nice. The colors look very Red-like, so quite realistic, but also pretty cinematic. Dynamic range is very good. The slow motion footage looks nice, so from an image quality standpoint, the Red Komodo doesn't disappoint there either. So what about the price? Because typically Red cameras tend to be rather expensive. Well, the Komodo is kind of cheap, or at least it's cheap for a Red camera. It costs around $6,000, which in the UK I imagine will translate to about £6,000. £6,000 is a pretty good deal for a Red. Of course, you're going to need a bunch of accessories to rig it up, but as they don't have to be Red proprietary accessories, they don't have to cost a ton of money. For £1,000 you could get the monitor, 2 batteries, some CFast cards, and be basically ready to go. So price-wise, this is actually looking pretty competitive. I think this is a very good place for Red to pitch the camera at. It's at a professional level price point, but more of an entry level professional price point. It's in the same area as the Canon C300 Mark III, the FS7, the FX9, the Blackmagic Ursa Mini, but it's a Red. And as much as I hate to say it, just having the Red name on a camera, it kind of makes it more desirable. And if you're trying to get hired by someone, if you can just say, well, I have a Red, there everyone goes, whoa, a Red, a Red. It just has that name. It inspires confidence in producers and people who are hiring you for projects. Red Komodo looks pretty cool to me. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you found it useful or entertaining, then please consider leaving a like and subscribing so as not to miss any new videos. Let me know in the comments down below what you think of the Red Komodo, especially if you're considering buying one, because I'm very curious to see what the reaction is by the rest of the camera community. And the last thing, just before I end the video, is the Kickstarter, which I talked about in last week's video. The Gap Year in Blandston project that I have been a cinematographer on for 2 episodes previously, and I will be the cinematographer on the next episode. Well, the Kickstarter is currently live, and it has until the end of August, I believe, to reach its budget funding goal. So if you have some spare time, please go and check it out, and if you like the look of it, then maybe share it around with some other people, because it's a really cool project, and the past 2 episodes, they turned out really well. So I am honestly pretty excited to see what could happen in a 3rd episode if it had a little more budget. Anyway, thanks for watching, see you later.